before God as the other sons of God. But God specifically asking him, where was he coming from? And after saying, oh yeah, I've been walking up and down in the earth, God then brought his attention to Job. So was it that, Satan did not notice Job? Probably he did, because he was the greatest man in the East and had all these things. And God said that he's perfect and he's upright. And Satan said, oh, but does Job fear God for naught? So Satan was saying that because God had given all this provision to Job, that this is why Job feared God. This is why Job was shunning evil. And upon this note, and Satan was saying, yeah, you've placed a hedge about him and about his house and all that he has, meaning Satan was not allowed to touch it. So, and this is a very important thing for us to learn, that Satan does not come and touch things of his own volition. Not God. If God does not allow it, it will not happen. So what then proceeds from that is that God said to Satan in verse 11, sorry, not in verse 11, in verse 12, behold, all that he hath is in thy power, not only upon himself, put not forth thine hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. So God then gave Satan permission to take things away from Job. For Satan brought forth the argument that that Job was serving God because he was being prosperous. So Satan went out, and then we hear the story of the children were feasting and drinking, and at some point, which probably was soon after Satan left the presence of God. And a messenger just comes to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the asses feeding beside them, in verse 15. And the Sabaeans fell upon them, took them away. Yea, they've slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. And while he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, the fire of God is fallen from heaven and hath burnt up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. And I only am escaped alone to tell thee. And while he was yet speaking, came another also. The Chaldeans made out 3 bands, fell upon the camels, have carried them away, slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and only one left to tell the tale. And while he was yet speaking, so it was as if in a moment, Job was getting all of this bad news. The greatest man that lived in the East, that had all this wealth and provision in a day, all these things, because it says, while this one was yet speaking, there came another. Thy sons, in verse 18, and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness and smote the 4 corners of the house. And it fell upon the young men, and they are dead. And only one escaped to tell. So what I want to bring to our attention is that imagine yourself as Job. I mean, we've said that we know the story, but I want us to today pay particular attention to, this was a man who before God was upright, who God actually presented to Satan as being upright, and Satan bringing the accusation that, oh, he will not serve you for naught. There is a price to, what he's doing. And God said, okay, well, this is a moment in which it was time for testing. It was time for a trying of Job's faith. And had we get this perspective, we see in heaven what was happening, and we see in earth what was happening to Job. But oftentimes, as we live our lives, we are not aware of what's happening in heaven. We are living our lives on earth, and all these things are happening in the heavens, and we are not aware. We're not aware of the transactions that are taking place. We're not aware of the moments where God is saying to Satan, have you noticed my servant Hans? Have you noticed my servant Guma? Man that feareth God escheweth evil. And Satan bringing the accusation that no, but this comes at a cost. And God saying, okay, well then, all that he has is in your hands. Now, can we think of God saying that about us to Satan? All that he has is in your hands, but you touch him, you don't touch him. That is, when you think about it, it's beyond, I should say, you would see this as something that no man could take. So, these days it doesn't take much for a lot of us to say, oh, our mental health is being challenged, by a few challenges out there at work, wherever we are. But this was Job, who was enjoying all the successes and being so very careful. He was not, it wasn't that he had all these things and then forgot about God, which a lot of us do. He was being careful to always be offering burnt offerings, to always giving to God, back to God, what God had given him. And, obviously not in the same measure, but, this was far more than a lot of men were doing in the earth at the time. But here, all these calamities came on Job. And I just think, what if I heard all these things in one day, I would have probably passed out. This is when people hear bad news and they faint. You just cannot take anymore when you hear all your cattle, all, everything that you have, your house, everything. And by the descriptions of it, a great wind coming and just taking everything, a house collapsing. And yeah, these things came from heaven. And then, their first thought is, oh, God is punishing me, or the thoughts of others would be, God is punishing this person. So what is the lesson that we're learning here? Do we then look on trials and tribulations and testings as us failing God? And we do tend to do that, to say, oh, as Job's friends implied when they came around, oh, perhaps you sinned, or, your ancestors, or, something wasn't quite right about you, you offended God. And much the opposite was that God was so pleased with him that he allowed Satan to. And we see at the end of chapter 1, in verse 20, Job arose and rent his mantle, shaved his head, and fell down upon the ground and worshipped, and said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. So, how many times have we charged God foolishly? Thinking, and in charging God foolishly, yes, he could have cursed God. Yes, he could have said, well, God is an unfair God. Or he could have said, God is punishing in charging God foolishly. But Job did not do that. And, God who knows all things, God knew the outcome of Job's saga. And this is chapter 1, and so much has happened. And then, but Job has many more chapters, many musings on who God is, who man is. And out of all this comes the reasoning of man, how man would see things in his own way, and whereas God sees things in his way. And then we realize that God's thoughts really are not our thoughts. God does not look on life, on us, as we do. And this is our challenge today, that we come into God's thoughts, not our own thoughts, not our own ways, not our own reasonings. We're always quick to blame ourselves for things that may happen when it may not be so. And we have to be very careful in that, because even in doing so, we are displaying pride. Because what we are saying is, God, you are not able to change me. You're not able to bring me into the promise of becoming as your son. You're not able to bring me into the promise of having Christ, of becoming Christ. And so, we ought to be very careful that, we are not causing offense to God. And so, we go to the next chapter, and then, Satan then ramps it up another level, where he's saying to God, you didn't let me touch him. And then God say, okay, you can touch him, but just don't take his life. And Satan then does his, worse, which is, putting leprosy on Job. And at that point, when your own self is being touched, many would have faltered. But Job, held sway and was then inundated by, all the speakings of his own wife, his friends, and so on. So what I want to encourage you, brethren, is to expect that in the midst of the prosperity, in the midst of the privilege of hearing the word of righteousness, and the privilege of, gathering for meetings, streaming messages, that this that you're receiving, all the revelation and the knowledge, that it will be tried. It will be put to the test. And we have to be ready for that. We have to expect it. But also have faith and trust that God, He's able to keep us in the midst of it. That is not by our own strength, but by His might, that we're able to make it through. Yes, we will have our emotions. And, even with Job, he too had his emotion, but he was mindful to remember that how he came into the world and how he would really leave the world. And he was prepared to say, well, if this is the end, then it is, but blessed be the name of the Lord. So let us, brethren, always say, blessed be the name of the Lord, that we come into the understanding of the name of the Lord and what that means for us. For no great person who, has been written about in the scripture, they have all had their times of testing and trials. And, we're not exempt from it. We'll not avoid it. But what I would like to encourage us to do is to trust God in the midst of it. And I'm saying it, I'm not saying it's easy, but we know that God doesn't give us more than we can bear. And this is what we hold on to. It doesn't mean that we don't sorrow, we don't grieve, we do. But there is the bigger picture. There is the life that is not just in life that we get after we die, but that beyond these earthly things, there are things happening in the heavens. So be encouraged. I hope this has does mean something to someone, and I just pray that God will keep us in these trying times, because they are very trying. You know, we have come into greater understanding of what it is to have the salvation